Hey guys, tonight we begin with Viking madness, and I mean that quite literally. You think modern mental health care is complicated? Try being declared possessed by Loki in 9th century Norway and see how that works out for you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through the surprisingly complex world of Viking mental health treatment. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Viking attitudes toward mental illness. Most people imagine bearded warriors either completely ignoring psychological problems or immediately declaring someone possessed by evil spirits and banishing them to freeze in the wilderness. In reality, Viking society had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of mental health that would make some modern therapists nod in approval, though admittedly, their treatment methods might get you arrested today. This wasn't some barbaric free-for-all where anyone acting strangely got an axe to the head. Think of it more like having a really intense, somewhat violent family intervention, but with more mead and considerably more supernatural explanations. The Vikings actually recognized different types of mental conditions, had specific terms for various psychological states, and developed treatment protocols that, while certainly not FDA approved, showed remarkable insight into the human psyche. Instead of our modern approach of take 2 pills and call me in the morning, Vikings operated on a sacrifice a goat and call the local wise woman system. But here's the thing, they understood that mental health existed on a spectrum, that some conditions were temporary while others were permanent, and that social support was crucial for recovery. They just happened to believe that some of these conditions were caused by angry gods, vengeful spirits, or eating the wrong mushrooms, which, let's be honest, might explain a few things about Viking behavior in general. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, was a time when your average Scandinavian had about as much scientific understanding of neuroscience as a modern person has of quantum physics, which is to say, just enough to sound dangerous at parties. Medieval Scandinavia wasn't the progressive mental health paradise we might imagine from watching too many historical dramas. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape where survival often depended on your ability to swing a sword and your willingness to sail into the unknown hoping for better weather and weaker enemies. The various jarls, kings, and local strongmen controlled not just land and resources, but also the interpretation of what constituted normal versus abnormal behavior. If the local chieftain decided your anxiety disorder was actually you being cursed by a rival clan, well, congratulations. You now had a curse problem instead of a mental health issue. This wasn't exactly a democratic process where everyone got to vote on diagnostic criteria. Religious and social leaders, the Gothi, skalds, and various wise women, held enormous influence over how mental conditions were understood and treated. They controlled the narrative around what was considered divine inspiration versus dangerous madness. And trust me, you did not want to end up on the wrong side of that particular diagnosis. These weren't licensed professionals with degrees hanging on their longhouse walls. They were individuals who combined genuine observational skills with a healthy dose of supernatural interpretation and whatever herbal remedies happened to be growing nearby. If you thought medieval medicine was rough in general, mental health treatment was like playing diagnostic roulette with stakes that could range from drink this suspicious tea to we're going to need to perform a ritual that involves a lot of blood and possibly relocating you to a different dimension. The consequences of being labeled as mentally ill could vary wildly depending on your social status, the nature of your condition, and whether the local authority figures had been having a particularly good or bad week. Meet Erik the Contemplative. Yes, that was actually his nickname, and no, it wasn't meant as a compliment. Erik was a 10th century Norwegian who, according to the sagas, would spend hours staring at the horizon, muttering to himself about the futility of existence and the meaninglessness of raiding. In modern terms, we might recognize Erik as someone dealing with what we call depression or an anxiety disorder. To his Viking contemporaries, Erik was clearly having an extended conversation with some very pessimistic spirits. Erik's family initially tried the standard Viking approach to mental health issues. They told him to snap out of it, handed him a sword, and suggested he work through his feelings by hitting things with it. When that didn't work, shocking I know, they moved on to more creative solutions. His brother Olaf decided Erik needed more social interaction and dragged him to every feast, raid, and community gathering within a 50-mile radius. Erik's response was to sit in the corner looking like someone had just told him that Valhalla was full and they weren't taking applications. But here's where it gets interesting. Erik's community didn't abandon him. Instead, they adapted. They found roles for him that worked with his temperament rather than against it. Erik became the settlement's unofficial philosopher and strategic planner, roles that utilized his tendency toward deep contemplation rather than fighting it. He was the guy who would spend hours thinking through the logistics of a raid or the implications of a trade agreement, turning his brooding into a valuable community asset. The twist? Erik's supposed curse or spiritual affliction made him incredibly valuable during negotiations with other clans. His melancholy demeanor and tendency to see the worst-case scenario in every situation made him an excellent judge of character and a master at identifying potential problems before they became actual disasters. Other Vikings would bring their disputes to Erik specifically because his pessimistic outlook helped him see through deception and identify the real issues at stake. The consequences were fascinating. Erik went from being seen as potentially cursed to being viewed as blessed. With unusual insight, his community learned to work with his mental state rather than trying to force him into a warrior mold that clearly wasn't going to fit. They developed what we might recognize as accommodations, creating a social role that played to his strength, while managing his limitations. This wasn't unique to Erik either. Viking society had multiple examples of individuals whose unusual mental states were eventually recognized as having specific value to the community. The difference between being labeled as mad versus touched by the gods often came down to whether your particular form of neurodivergence happened to be useful to the people around you. Which, honestly, isn't that different from how we handle things today? We just have better terminology and fewer references to divine intervention. This wasn't just about individual Vikings having bad days or personality quirks. The way Viking society handled mental illness revealed fundamental truths about their values, their understanding of human nature, and their approach to community responsibility. Who was considered worth saving, who deserved support, and who got labeled as a lost cause said everything about what these communities valued and how they saw themselves. The stakes were literally life and death in many cases. Being labeled as hopelessly mad could mean exile, which in the harsh Scandinavian climate was essentially a death sentence with extra steps. But being recognized as having a valuable form of divine insight could elevate someone from social outcast to community treasure. The difference often came down to politics, timing, and sheer luck, factors that determined whether your mental health struggles would be seen as a spiritual gift or a dangerous curse. These decisions affected entire families and communities. When someone was declared mad, their relatives faced social consequences, their children might be viewed with suspicion, and their property rights could be challenged. But when someone was recognized as having special insight, their family's social status could rise dramatically. The The community's approach to mental health wasn't just about individual treatment. It was about maintaining social order, managing resources, and determining who belonged and who didn't. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual cases. How a community handled mental illness influenced everything from trade relationships to military alliances. A reputation for either wisdom or madness could follow a settlement for generations, affecting their ability to attract new residents, form political partnerships, or maintain their standing in the complex web of Viking Age politics. But Erik, the Contemplative, was just the beginning of a much more complex story. The Vikings had developed an entire taxonomy of mental conditions, each with its own supernatural explanation, treatment protocol, and social implications. Some conditions were viewed as temporary afflictions that could be cured with the right combination of rituals, herbs, and community support. Others were seen as permanent states that required long-term management and careful social integration. The most fascinating cases were those involving what the Vikings called cedar sickness, a condition that could either mark someone as a powerful practitioner of magic or as dangerously unstable, depending on how their symptoms manifested and how skilled they were at managing their condition. These individuals walked a razor's edge between reverence and exile, their fate often determined by factors completely outside their control. But before we dive into the supernatural explanations and magical treatments, we need to understand the social and economic factors that shaped how Viking communities approached mental health. Because as much as they believed in gods and spirits, the Vikings were also intensely practical people who couldn't afford to waste human resources or ignore community stability. Their approach to mental illness was shaped as much by necessity as by belief, creating a system that was both surprisingly compassionate and utterly ruthless, depending on the circumstances. The Viking diagnostic system for mental illness was like a medieval WebMD, but with more references to angry gods and fewer suggestions to drink more water. Unlike our modern approach of consulting the DSM-5 and hoping your insurance covers therapy, Vikings operated on what we might call the divine intervention theory of mental health. Basically, if you were acting strangely, someone upstairs was definitely involved, and figuring out who and why became a community detective story with supernatural elements. They recognized several distinct categories of mental disturbance, each with its own set of symptoms, causes, and treatment protocols. There was God-touched madness, which was generally considered a blessing disguised as an inconvenience. There was curse sickness, which was exactly as fun as it sounds, and usually involved identifying which neighbor you'd recently offended. Then there was cider madness, which was either a ticket to becoming a respected magical practitioner or a one-way trip to social exile, depending on whether you could make your visions useful to the community. The Vikings understood that mental states could fluctuate. They had terms for temporary madness versus permanent conditions, seasonal depression, which made perfect sense when you're living through 6 months of darkness every year, and what we might recognize as situational versus chronic mental health issues. They just happened to attribute most of these conditions to supernatural causes, which led to some interesting treatment approaches that combined practical psychology with elaborate rituals. This system developed because Viking society couldn't afford to simply discard people who were mentally ill. Populations were too small and resources too scarce. They needed to find ways to integrate or manage these individuals that served the community's needs, while acknowledging that not everyone's brain worked the same way. The result was a surprisingly nuanced approach that recognized mental health as existing on a spectrum, even if their explanations for that spectrum involved more magic and fewer neurotransmitters than we'd prefer. Take the case of Þórunn the Seeress, a woman from Iceland whose story illustrates the fine line between madness and divine insight in Viking society. Þórunn began experiencing what we would recognize as auditory hallucinations and severe mood swings in her early 20s. She would spend days in deep depression, barely speaking or eating, followed by periods of manic energy where she would deliver elaborate prophecies about future events and speak in voices that weren't her own. Initially, her family thought she was suffering from curse sickness, possibly inflicted by a rival family over a land dispute. They tried the standard treatments, ritual cleansing, protective amulets, and consulting with the local gothy about possible supernatural enemies. When these approaches failed to stabilize her condition, they moved on to more dramatic interventions, including a rather expensive ceremony involving the sacrifice of several valuable animals and a consultation with a traveling vulva, essentially a professional oracle and magical practitioner. The turning point came when Thorun's prophecies began coming true with uncomfortable accuracy. She predicted a harsh winter that would kill most of the livestock, and then it happened. She warned about a trading expedition that would end in disaster, and 3 ships were lost in a storm exactly as she described. She foretold the death of a prominent chieftain from a seemingly minor injury, and sure enough, the man died of infection after what should have been a survivable wound. Suddenly, Thorun's mental illness became a community asset. Her mood swings were reinterpreted as periods of divine communication, followed by recovery phases. Her hallucinations were reconsidered as messages from the spirit world. Her social isolation during depressive episodes was reframed as necessary, spiritual preparation for receiving visions. The same symptoms that had marked her as potentially cursed now marked her as blessed with supernatural insight. The community's response was to create a special role for Thorun that accommodated her mental state while utilizing her apparent prophetic abilities. They built her a small dwelling on the outskirts of the settlement, where she could experience her visions without disrupting daily life, but close enough that people could consult her when needed. They assigned rotating caregivers to ensure she ate regularly and had company during her depressive periods, essentially creating what we might recognize as a support network. One particularly memorable incident involved Thorun predicting that the community's planned raid on a neighboring settlement would result in disaster because the ravens were flying backwards, a sign that apparently made perfect sense to Vikings, but would probably get you some concerned looks today. The chieftain, being a practical man who'd learned to pay attention to Thorun's warnings, postponed the raid. A week later, scouts reported that the target settlement had been reinforced by unexpected allies and was now virtually impregnable. Another famous case was that of Bjorn the Berserker, whose episodes of what we might recognize as psychotic breaks were interpreted as battle fury sent by Odin. Bjorn would experience periods of extreme agitation, paranoid thoughts about enemies plotting against him, and violent outbursts that could last for days. In modern terms, we might suspect bipolar disorder with psychotic features, possibly triggered by traumatic stress from constant warfare. But in Viking society, Bjorn's condition made him incredibly valuable as a warrior. His paranoid vigilance made him an excellent scout and guard. His violent episodes, when properly channeled, made him devastating in battle. His periods of depression and withdrawal were seen as necessary recovery time between divine communications. The community learned to manage Bjorn's condition by giving him specific roles that utilized his symptoms productively while protecting both him and others during his more dangerous episodes. They developed strategies for recognizing the early signs of Bjorn's episodes and would either remove him from situations where he might cause harm or deliberately place him in combat situations where his fury could be useful. This wasn't sophisticated psychological treatment, but it was a practical approach to managing a complex mental health condition within the constraints of their understanding and resources. But it wasn't that simple, because it never is when humans are involved. The same symptoms that made Thorun a respected seeress could get another person labeled as dangerously mad and exiled from the community. The difference often came down to factors that had nothing to do with the actual mental health condition: social status, family connections, timing, and pure luck. Consider the case of Einar the Unfortunate, whose prophetic visions were consistently wrong and whose mood swings seemed to follow no pattern that benefited anyone. Einar experienced symptoms very similar to Thorin's: auditory hallucinations, severe depression, alternating with manic episodes, and claims of supernatural communication. The problem was that Einar's predictions were spectacularly inaccurate. His visions seemed to involve mostly complaints from minor household spirits about inadequate offerings, and his family lacked the political influence to protect him when his condition became inconvenient. Where Thorin was seen as touched by the gods, Einar was viewed as cursed or possibly fraudulent. The same community that built special accommodations for one CRS eventually decided that Einar's condition was either fake or the result of divine punishment for unspecified crimes. The social response was completely different despite remarkably similar symptoms, illustrating how arbitrary the line between divine blessing and dangerous madness could be. Viking society also struggled with the economic realities of supporting individuals whose mental conditions didn't provide obvious community benefits. A depressed farmer who couldn't work the fields was a drain on resources regardless of whether his condition was attributed to cursed sickness or divine displeasure. A warrior whose PTSD made him unreliable in battle was a liability, even if his symptoms were understood as spiritual wounds that required supernatural healing. The communities had to balance their beliefs about divine intervention with practical concerns about survival and resource allocation. This led to some uncomfortable contradictions where the same society that revered certain forms of madness as divine gifts would abandon other mentally ill individuals when supporting them became too expensive or dangerous. There were also gender complications that added another layer of complexity to how mental illness was interpreted and treated. Women experiencing certain types of psychological symptoms were more likely to be viewed as potential vulvas or CRSs, while men with similar symptoms might be seen as warriors touched by battle fury or as individuals suffering from supernatural punishment. The social roles available to mentally ill individuals were heavily influenced by gender expectations, which could mean vastly different outcomes for similar conditions. The result was a complex social ecosystem where mental illness existed in a constant state of reinterpretation and negotiation. Families of mentally ill individuals became skilled at managing both the condition itself and the community's perception of it. They learned to emphasize aspects of the condition that seemed beneficial while downplaying elements that might be seen as dangerous or useless. Communities developed informal networks for sharing information about managing different types of mental conditions. Knowledge about herbal treatments, ritual practices, and social accommodations was passed down through families and shared between settlements. This created a surprisingly sophisticated, if unscientific, body of practical knowledge about mental health management that recognized the importance of both individual treatment and community support. The religious and social authorities had to navigate the delicate balance between maintaining their interpretive authority over supernatural matters while acknowledging that some of their explanations and treatments weren't particularly effective. A Gothi whose ritual cures consistently failed to help mentally ill community members risked losing credibility, but admitting that some conditions might not be supernatural in origin could undermine the entire religious framework that justified their authority. The long-term implications were significant for how Viking society understood human nature and community responsibility. The recognition that some individuals required special accommodation and support, even when they couldn't contribute in traditional ways, laid groundwork for more sophisticated approaches to social welfare and community care. The understanding that mental states could fluctuate and that people might need different types of support at different times influenced how communities organized themselves and allocated resources. These practices also influenced Viking approaches to conflict, resolution and legal proceedings. The recognition that some individuals might not be fully responsible for their actions due to mental conditions led to modifications in how justice was administered and how punishment was determined. This wasn't modern legal psychiatry, but it showed an understanding that mental state affected both behavior and accountability. The economic consequences were also substantial. Communities that developed effective ways of integrating mentally ill individuals into productive roles had access to a broader range of human resources and were often more resilient during difficult periods. Those that simply expelled or ignored mental health issues were essentially wasting human potential and creating unnecessary social instability. Meanwhile, the practical aspects of actually treating mental illness were developing along parallel tracks to these diagnostic and social frameworks, while communities were figuring out how to interpret and integrate mentally ill individuals, healers, wise women, and religious practitioners were developing increasingly sophisticated treatment protocols that combined herbal medicine, ritualistic practices, and what we might recognize as early forms of psychological therapy. These treatment approaches revealed another layer of complexity in Viking attitudes toward mental health, because they had to balance supernatural explanations with practical results. A treatment that was theoretically sound according to religious belief, but consistently failed to help patients, created problems that went beyond individual suffering to questions about the entire cosmological framework that justified both religious authority and social organization. The evolution of these treatment practices and the fascinating characters who developed and implemented them reveals yet another dimension of how Viking society approached the challenge of understanding and managing the human mind in an era when the boundary between psychology and magic was essentially non-existent. If Viking diagnostic methods were like medieval WebMD with supernatural explanations, then their treatment approaches were like combining a pharmacy, a therapy session, and a magic show, with the very real possibility that any of these elements might accidentally kill you. Where their diagnostic system was all about figuring out which gods were involved and why, their treatment philosophy operated on the principle that if you threw enough different approaches at a mental health problem, something was bound to work. And if it didn't, well, at least you tried everything short of time travel. Viking treatment methods fell into several categories, each with its own logic and varying degrees of actual effectiveness. There were herbal remedies that ranged from genuinely helpful to "this will definitely make you forget about your depression because you'll be too busy trying not to die from poisoning." There were ritualistic treatments that served important psychological and social functions even when their supernatural premises were questionable. And there were what we might recognize as early forms of talk therapy, though they usually involved significantly more references to family honor and significantly fewer comfortable chairs. The practitioners who administered these treatments were a fascinating mix of genuine healers, skilled herbalists, religious authorities, and what we might charitably call enthusiastic amateurs with strong opinions about supernatural intervention. Some had real knowledge about the medicinal properties of plants and the psychological benefits of social support. Others were essentially winging it with a combination of traditional knowledge, creative improvisation, and enough confidence to convince desperate families to try whatever they were selling. This system developed because mental illness was seen as a problem that required multiple types of intervention: spiritual, physical, social, and magical. Vikings understood that the mind and body were connected, that social relationships affected mental health, and that treating symptoms without addressing underlying causes was often ineffective. They just happened to interpret these insights through a framework that involved considerably more supernatural explanation than modern medicine would prefer, leading to treatment protocols that were simultaneously sophisticated and completely bonkers. The most famous practitioner of Viking mental health treatment was probably Ingrid, the herb speaker, a Völva from Denmark who developed what might have been the ancient world's first integrated approach to psychological therapy. Ingrid's methods combined herbal medicine, ritualistic practices, and what we would recognize as counseling sessions, though she would have described her work as negotiating with spirits on behalf of confused humans. Ingrid's approach began with what she called listening to the sickness, which involved spending hours talking with patients and their families to understand the history and context of their mental health problems. This wasn't just diagnostic interviewing. Ingrid believed that mental illness often resulted from unresolved conflicts with supernatural forces, and that understanding the source of these conflicts was essential for effective treatment. In practice, this meant she was conducting detailed psychological assessments while telling herself she was investigating spiritual disputes. One of her most successful cases involved a young warrior named Magnus who had developed what we would recognize as severe PTSD after surviving a particularly brutal battle. Magnus was experiencing nightmares, sudden violent outbursts, an inability to sleep, and a persistent feeling that he was being watched by enemies. His family had tried the standard treatments, protective amulets, cleansing rituals, and consultations with local religious authorities. But Magnus continued to deteriorate. Ingrid's approach was revolutionary for its time. She began by creating what she called a safe telling space, essentially a therapeutic environment where Magnus could describe his experiences without fear of judgment or social consequences. She used a combination of mild sedative herbs and ritualistic practices to help Magnus relax enough to discuss traumatic memories that he had been avoiding. She encouraged him to tell his story repeatedly, each time adding more details and emotional content, which served the same function as modern exposure therapy. But Ingrid's real innovation was her integration of Magnus's family and community into the treatment process. She organized what she called healing circles, where Magnus could share his experiences with other warriors who had survived similar traumas. These sessions served multiple functions. They normalized Magnus's symptoms by showing him that other respected warriors had similar experiences. They provided practical coping strategies from people who had learned to manage similar conditions, and they reinforced his social connections during a period when he felt isolated and misunderstood. The ritualistic elements of Ingrid's treatment were equally sophisticated, though her explanations for why they worked would sound bizarre to modern therapists. She conducted elaborate ceremonies designed to release trapped battle spirits that were supposedly causing Magnus's symptoms. These rituals involved symbolic representations of the traumatic battle, guided visualization exercises that helped Magnus process traumatic memories, and community affirmations of his value and belonging. The herbal component of Magnus's treatment included plants that we now know have genuine psychoactive properties helpful for anxiety and depression, combined with others that were probably useless but harmless. Ingrid's knowledge of medicinal plants was impressive. She used valerian root for sleep problems, St. John's wort for mood stabilization, and various combinations of herbs that modern research has confirmed have mild anti-anxiety properties. What made Ingrid's approach particularly effective was her understanding that successful treatment required addressing multiple aspects of mental health problems simultaneously. She recognized that Magnus's symptoms had physical, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions that all needed attention. Her treatment protocol addressed sleep problems, anxiety symptoms, social isolation, and the meaning-making processes that help people integrate traumatic experiences into their life stories. Another fascinating practitioner was Olav the Mind Mender, who specialized in what Vikings called thought sickness, conditions that involve distorted thinking patterns, obsessive behaviors, and what we might recognize as various types of anxiety disorders. Olav's approach was based on the theory that mental illness often resulted from people becoming trapped in cursed thinking patterns that needed to be broken through a combination of physical intervention and cognitive retraining. Olav used techniques that were remarkably similar to modern cognitive behavioral therapy, though he would have described his work as teaching people to fight evil thoughts with warrior techniques. He helped patients identify negative thought patterns, develop strategies for interrupting these patterns when they occurred, and practice alternative ways of thinking about problematic situations. He just happened to frame these interventions in terms of spiritual warfare rather than psychological healing. His treatment sessions involved patients practicing what he called mind battles, essentially role-playing exercises where they would practice countering negative thoughts with more balanced perspectives. He taught breathing techniques that he claimed would strengthen the spirit against evil influences, but that functioned as anxiety management tools. He assigned homework that required patients to practice new thinking patterns in daily situations, which served the same function as modern behavioral experiments. This wasn't isolated to a few innovative practitioners. There was a consistent pattern across Viking settlements of mental health treatment that combined practical psychology with supernatural explanation. Communities throughout Scandinavia developed similar approaches that recognize the importance of social support, the value of meaning-making processes, and the need for individualized treatment protocols, even when they attributed their success to divine intervention rather than psychological insight. The pattern emerged because Viking society had to balance several competing demands: the need to help suffering community members, the requirement to maintain social stability, the obligation to respect religious and supernatural explanations for illness, and the practical necessity of not wasting resources on ineffective treatments. This led to treatment approaches that were simultaneously pragmatic and mystical, combining genuine therapeutic techniques with elaborate ritualistic elements. Viking healers consistently recognized that mental health problems affected the whole person and required comprehensive intervention. They understood that treating symptoms without addressing underlying causes was often ineffective, that social relationships were crucial for recovery, and that patients needed to feel that their experiences were understood and validated by their communities. They just happened to interpret these insights through a framework that involved gods, spirits, and magical interventions. The social patterns around treatment were equally consistent. Families were expected to participate actively in treatment processes, communities were involved in creating supportive environments for recovery, and successful treatment was seen as benefiting everyone rather than just the individual patient. This collective approach to mental health treatment created strong incentives for developing effective interventions and maintaining long-term support systems. There was also a consistent pattern of combining different types of treatment approaches: herbal medicine, ritualistic practices, social interventions, and what we might recognize as early forms of psychotherapy. Viking healers understood that mental health problems were complex and required multiple types of intervention, leading to treatment protocols that addressed physical symptoms, psychological processes, social relationships, and spiritual concerns. Simultaneously, the economic patterns were equally revealing. Effective mental health treatment was expensive and time-consuming, requiring specialized knowledge, rare materials, and significant community resources. This created a system where treatment quality often depended on the patient's social status and their family's ability to pay for extensive intervention. But it also created incentives for healers to develop more effective and efficient treatment methods, leading to innovations that spread throughout Viking communities. The effects of these treatment approaches were far-reaching and complex. On the positive side, Viking communities developed remarkably sophisticated methods for managing mental health problems that recognized the importance of social support, individualized treatment, and comprehensive intervention. Their approaches to trauma treatment, anxiety management, and mood disorders included elements that modern psychology would recognize as evidence-based practices, even when the theoretical explanations were based on supernatural beliefs, rather than scientific understanding. Who benefited from these treatment approaches was largely determined by social status, family resources, and the nature of their specific mental health condition. Individuals whose symptoms could be interpreted as divine gifts or whose conditions responded well to available treatments often experienced improved social status and community integration. Warriors whose PTSD could be managed through existing treatment protocols might return to productive roles with enhanced reputations for having survived spiritual trials. But who suffered was equally revealing about the limitations and biases built into Viking mental health treatment. Individuals whose conditions didn't respond to available treatments, whose symptoms couldn't be interpreted as spiritually meaningful, or whose families lacked the resources to pay for extensive interventions, often faced social exclusion, economic hardship, and abandonment. The same system that could provide sophisticated support for some patients could be brutally indifferent to others whose conditions were seen as hopeless or whose treatment was viewed as too expensive. The unintended consequences were substantial and long-lasting. The integration of supernatural explanations into mental health treatment created opportunities for exploitation by unscrupulous practitioners who promised miraculous cures in exchange for significant payments. The emphasis on spiritual causes for mental illness sometimes prevented communities from addressing practical issues like malnutrition, toxic exposures, or social stressors that might have been contributing to psychological problems. The success of some Viking treatment approaches also reinforced beliefs about supernatural causation that could be harmful in other contexts. Communities that had seen dramatic recoveries through ritualistic treatments might be more likely to interpret other medical problems as supernatural in origin, leading to delays in appropriate medical care or reliance on ineffective, magical interventions for conditions that required different types of treatment. How these treatment approaches shaped future developments in Scandinavian culture was profound. The recognition that mental health problems were treatable conditions rather than unchangeable character flaws influenced how later generations approached psychological suffering. The understanding that effective treatment required community, involvement, and social support laid groundwork for more sophisticated approaches to public health and social welfare. The integration of psychological insight with spiritual practice also influenced the development of Scandinavian religious and philosophical traditions, creating frameworks for understanding human nature that recognized both the complexity of mental life and the importance of meaning-making processes in psychological health. Yet even as these sophisticated treatment approaches were developing, throughout Viking communities, a darker and more dramatic aspect of mental health treatment was emerging alongside them. The same society that could provide compassionate, effective care for some mentally ill individuals also developed increasingly elaborate methods for dealing with cases where standard treatments failed, or where the patient's condition was viewed as dangerous to the community. The phenomenon of battle madness and what Vikings called wolf sickness represented a completely different category of mental health condition that required different social responses and treatment approaches. These conditions were seen as both blessing and curse, providing individuals with supernatural powers while potentially making them threats to community safety and social order. The most dramatic and controversial cases involved individuals whose mental health problems were interpreted as forms of divine possession that granted them extraordinary abilities, but also made them unpredictable and potentially violent. These cases tested the limits of Viking compassion and forced communities to make difficult decisions about public safety, individual rights, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The stories of these individuals and the community responses they generated revealed the most complex and ethically challenging aspects of how Viking society approached mental health treatment. By the late 9th century, Viking communities across Scandinavia were facing a growing crisis that challenged everything. They thought they understood about mental illness, divine intervention, and community safety. The phenomenon known as ulfhednar, literally wolf coats, and the related condition of berserksganga or berserker rage had evolved from occasional individual cases into what appeared to be a spreading epidemic of warriors who claimed to be possessed by animal spirits and demonstrated both supernatural fighting abilities and complete unpredictability in their behavior. This wasn't simply a matter of a few warriors getting overly enthusiastic in battle. Communities were dealing with individuals who would experience episodes of complete dissociation from reality, during which they claimed to transform into wolves or bears, would fight with inhuman strength and apparent immunity to pain, and then would have no memory of their actions once the episode ended. Think of it as if someone combined PTSD, dissociative disorders, and performance-enhancing drugs, then added a religious framework that encouraged the most extreme possible expression of these symptoms. The key players involved weren't just the affected warriors themselves, but entire communities that had to figure out how to manage individuals who could be invaluable allies in warfare, but were also potential threats to everyone around them during peacetime. Families found themselves caring for warriors who might transform without warning from beloved relatives into unpredictable strangers who didn't recognize their own children. Military leaders had to balance the tactical advantages of having seemingly invincible warriors against the risks of commanding soldiers who might not distinguish between enemies and allies once their episodes began. The stakes involved were existential for both individuals and communities. A warrior experiencing wolf sickness could single-handedly turn the tide of a battle, making the difference between victory and total destruction for their clan. But the same individual could also pose an unmanageable threat to community safety, potentially killing neighbors, family members, or allies during an episode of uncontrolled rage. The social and economic costs of supporting these warriors during their non-functional periods had to be balanced against their military value, creating impossible decisions about resource allocation and community priorities. The most dramatic and well-documented case was that of Grim the Wolf Speaker, whose transformation from respected warrior to community terror illustrates both the potential benefits and catastrophic risks of battle madness in Viking society. Grim's story begins in 891 CE during a particularly brutal conflict between Danish and Norwegian clans over control of strategic trading routes through the Baltic Sea. Grim had been a capable but unremarkable warrior until the Battle of Stamford Creek, where he witnessed the systematic massacre of his entire warband by enemy forces who had used superior tactics and overwhelming numbers to trap them in an impossible position. According to the sagas, Grim was found 3 days after the battle, sitting among the corpses of his fallen comrades, covered in blood and speaking in what witnesses described as the voice of wolves calling to their pack. "The spirits of the slain have entered me," Grim reportedly told the rescue party that found him. "I carry their rage, and it burns like fire in my chest." This wasn't unusual. Many warriors experienced psychological trauma after devastating defeats, and claims of spiritual possession were a common way of explaining and coping with what we would now recognize as survivor's guilt and PTSD. But Grim's condition rapidly evolved beyond typical combat trauma. Within weeks of returning home, he began experiencing episodes where he would claim that his human consciousness was being replaced by the spirit of a massive wolf. During these episodes, which could last anywhere from hours to days, Grim would refuse to eat cooked food, would communicate primarily through growls and gestures, and would demonstrate physical capabilities that seemed impossible for a normal human being. The first major incident occurred during a feast celebrating the harvest. Grim had been sitting quietly with his family, appearing relatively normal, when something, witnesses couldn't agree on what, triggered one of his episodes. According to multiple accounts, Grimm's entire demeanor changed in seconds. His posture shifted, his facial expressions became unrecognizable, and he began making sounds that were described as more wolf than man. When a young warrior made a joking comment about Grimm's strange behavior, Grimm's response was immediate and devastating. He attacked with a speed and ferocity that shocked everyone present, using his teeth and fingernails as weapons and demonstrating strength that allowed him to literally tear apart wooden furniture and throw grown men across the room. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes, but by the time other warriors managed to restrain him, 2 people were dead and several others were seriously injured. What made the incident even more disturbing was Grimm's reaction when his episode ended. When he regained normal consciousness several hours later, he had no memory of the attack and was genuinely horrified when told what had happened. "This cannot be," he kept repeating. "I would never harm Bjorn. He was like a brother to me." This grief and confusion in Grimm's voice convinced most witnesses that his lack of memory was genuine, not an attempt to avoid responsibility. The community's response revealed the impossible dilemma posed by battle madness. Grimm had killed 2 people, including a young man who was well-liked and whose family demanded justice. Traditional Viking law was clear about the penalties for such violence, but Grimm had also been acting under what appeared to be supernatural influence, which created complications about his moral and legal responsibility for actions he couldn't remember committing. The situation became even more complex when military leaders pointed out that Grimm's condition might be incredibly valuable in warfare. If his wolf spirit could be controlled and directed against enemies rather than allies, he could potentially be worth dozens of ordinary warriors in battle. The strategic implications were enormous. Communities that could successfully weaponize battle madness would have significant military advantages over those that couldn't. A series of increasingly desperate experiments followed as the community tried to find ways to trigger and control Grimm's transformations. They tried various combinations of ritual preparation, herbal treatments, and psychological manipulation, hoping to find a method for directing his episodes toward appropriate targets. Some of these experiments showed promise. Grimm's wolf spirit seemed to respond to certain types of music, specific scents, and ritualistic preparations that involved recreating elements of the original traumatic battle. But the experiments also revealed the fundamental unpredictability of Grimm's condition. Even when his episodes were successfully triggered in controlled situations, there was no reliable way to ensure that he would attack only designated enemies. During one training exercise, Grimm's wolf spirit decided that the exercise leader was a threat and attacked him with the same devastating efficiency that had been demonstrated against actual enemies. The breaking point came during a raid against a neighboring settlement. Grimm had been prepared for battle using the most successful of the experimental techniques, and initially his transformation appeared to work perfectly. His wolf spirit emerged on cue. He attacked the enemy forces with supernatural ferocity, and his presence on the battlefield caused enemy warriors to flee in terror rather than face what they perceived as a supernatural opponent. But when the battle ended and victory was secured, Grimm's episode didn't end as expected. Instead of returning to normal consciousness, he remained in his wolf state and began attacking his own allies. Before he could be stopped, he had killed 3 of his fellow warriors and seriously wounded several others, including his own nephew, who had been fighting beside him throughout the raid. The aftermath was devastating for everyone involved. Grimm's military value was undeniable. His presence had made the difference between victory and defeat in the raid. But his unpredictability made him too dangerous to use in future conflicts, and his attack on his own allies had created blood feuds that threatened to tear the community apart. The response to Grimm's case split the community into factions that reflected broader tensions about how Viking society should handle the growing problem of battle madness. The traditionalists, led by the local Gothi and supported by the families of Grimm's victims, argued that supernatural possession didn't excuse murder and that Grimm should face the same penalties as any other killer. They pointed out that allowing warriors to claim divine possession as a defense against criminal charges would create a precedent that could undermine the entire legal system. The pragmatists, primarily military leaders and younger warriors, contended that Grimm's condition was too valuable to waste through execution or exile. They proposed establishing specialized units of battle-mad warriors who could be deployed in desperate situations where their unpredictability would be acceptable in exchange for their devastating effectiveness. This faction argued that Viking society was entering a new phase of warfare where supernatural abilities might be necessary for survival. The most immediate consequences were legal and social chaos. Grimm's case created a precedent that other warriors began invoking when accused of violent crimes. Claims of temporary possession by animal spirits, usually wolves or bears, became increasingly common defenses in assault and murder cases. Some of these claims were probably genuine, representing real psychological conditions triggered by combat trauma. Others were clearly opportunistic attempts to avoid punishment for deliberate violence. The families affected by battle madness faced impossible situations. They were caring for individuals who could be loving relatives one moment and deadly strangers the next, never knowing when a transformation might occur or what might trigger it. Many families began developing elaborate precautionary measures, removing weapons from their homes, establishing warning systems to alert neighbors when episodes began, and creating secure spaces where affected family members could be contained during their transformations. The political fallout extended far beyond individual communities. News of successful military applications of battle madness spread throughout Scandinavia, creating demand for warriors who possessed these abilities. Some communities began actively trying to create battle-mad warriors through various experimental techniques, including deliberate psychological trauma, ritual practices designed to invoke spiritual possession, and experimentation with psychoactive substances. The economic consequences were equally dramatic. Communities with battle-mad warriors faced increased costs for managing these individuals during peacetime, but also had access to military capabilities that could provide enormous economic advantages through successful raids and territorial expansion. This created a perverse incentive system where the social costs of battle madness had to be balanced against its potential military and economic benefits. Religious authorities struggled to maintain their interpretive authority in the face of phenomena that challenged existing theological frameworks. If battle madness was divine possession, as many claimed, then why did the gods choose some warriors and not others? Why did divine possession sometimes result in attacks on allies rather than enemies? The inability to provide satisfactory answers to these questions undermined confidence in traditional religious explanations and opened space for alternative theories about the nature of battle madness. The international implications were also significant. Communities that successfully weaponized battle madness gained reputations that extended far beyond their actual military capabilities. Stories of supernatural warriors spread throughout Europe, creating both fear and fascination with Viking military practices. This psychological warfare aspect of battle madness may have been as valuable as its actual combat applications, as enemies would sometimes surrender or flee rather than face opponents they believed possessed supernatural abilities. But perhaps the most profound consequence was the acceleration of social changes that were already occurring in Viking society. The need to manage battle madness required more sophisticated approaches to community organization, resource allocation, and social control. Communities had to develop new institutions and practices for dealing with individuals who didn't fit Traditional social categories laying groundwork for more complex forms of social organization that would characterize later medieval Scandinavian societies. This crisis over battle madness wasn't just about individual warriors losing their minds. It was a fundamental challenge to how Viking society understood the relationship between human agency, divine intervention, and community responsibility. The phenomenon forced communities to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of mental illness, the limits of personal accountability, and the acceptable costs of military advantage. The battle madness crisis revealed that Viking society's approach to mental illness was more fragile and contradictory than it appeared on the surface. The same communities that had developed sophisticated methods for integrating some mentally ill individuals struggled desperately when faced with conditions that couldn't be easily accommodated within existing social structures. The recognition that some mental health problems might be too dangerous or disruptive to manage through traditional approaches forced a re-evaluation of the entire framework for understanding psychological conditions. What the crisis revealed about Viking society was both admirable and disturbing. Their willingness to experiment with different approaches to managing battle madness showed flexibility and pragmatism that was impressive for its time. Their recognition that these warriors retained value despite their dangerous unpredictability demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human complexity that avoided simple categorizations of people as purely good or evil. But the crisis also exposed the limits of Viking compassion and the extent to which practical considerations could override humanitarian concerns. The willingness to weaponize mental illness, to deliberately create psychological trauma in pursuit of military advantage, and to sacrifice individual well-being for community benefit revealed aspects of Viking culture that were brutally utilitarian. In their calculations, long-term effects included changes in military organization, legal procedures, and social structures that influenced Scandinavian development for centuries. The recognition that some individuals might possess abilities that were both valuable and dangerous led to new approaches to managing exceptional individuals that would later influence how medieval Scandinavian societies dealt with various forms of social deviance and individual difference. The battle madness phenomenon also contributed to the development of more sophisticated understanding about the relationship between trauma, mental health, and social function that would influence how later Scandinavian societies approached veteran care, criminal justice, and social welfare. The recognition that some mental health conditions were caused by social circumstances rather than individual failings or supernatural intervention laid groundwork for more nuanced approaches to addressing psychological problems through social and environmental changes rather than just individual treatment. Around the dramatic cases of battle madness and supernatural possession, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in how Viking communities actually managed mental illness on a day-to-day basis. These individuals, healers, outcasts, and various eccentric specialists, often had more practical impact on mentally ill Vikings than the famous Völvers and renowned warriors whose stories dominated the sagas. First, meet Astrid, the herb wife, a woman who probably saved more Viking minds than all the dramatic ritual specialists combined, though she would never get credit for it because her methods were too practical and not nearly magical enough to make for good storytelling. Astrid operated out of a small settlement in what's now southern Sweden, and her approach to mental health treatment was refreshingly straightforward. Figure out what was actually wrong with people, use plants that actually worked, and don't worry too much about which gods might or might not be involved in the process. Astrid had developed what might have been medieval Scandinavia's first evidence-based approach to herbal medicine for psychological conditions. She kept detailed records carved into wooden tablets that she stored in her workshop, documenting which plant preparations worked for which types of mental health problems, what dosages were effective, and which combinations of treatments produced the best results. Her notes revealed a sophisticated understanding of medicinal botany that recognized the difference between plants that actually had psychoactive effects and those that were used primarily for their placebo value. What made Astrid particularly effective was her willingness to experiment and adapt her treatments based on actual results rather than theoretical frameworks. When traditional remedies failed, she would try new combinations of plants, different preparation methods, or alternative approaches to patient care. She was probably the first Viking healer to recognize that some mental health problems responded better to long-term, low-dose herbal treatments rather than dramatic, short-term interventions, anticipating modern approaches to psychiatric medication by several centuries. Then there was Bjorn the Mind Mender, who represented a different approach to Viking mental health care entirely. Bjorn was what we might call a cognitive therapist, though he would have described himself as a thought warrior who fights evil ideas with better ideas. His specialty was helping people whose mental health problems involved distorted thinking patterns, obsessive behaviors, and what Vikings called cursed thoughts, essentially intrusive and disturbing mental content that people couldn't control. Bjorn's methods were remarkably similar to modern cognitive behavioral therapy, though his explanations for why these methods worked were entirely supernatural. He taught patients to recognize negative thought patterns, develop strategies for interrupting these patterns when they occurred, and practice alternative ways of thinking about problematic situations. He just happened to frame these interventions in terms of spiritual warfare rather than psychological healing, describing negative thoughts as mind demons that needed to be fought with warrior thoughts and shield thinking. His treatment sessions were essentially cognitive therapy disguised as military training. Patients would practice thought battles where they learned to counter negative thinking with more balanced perspectives. He taught breathing techniques that he claimed would strengthen the mind shield against evil influences, but that functioned as anxiety management tools. He assigned homework that required patients to practice new thinking patterns in daily situations, creating behavioral experiments that tested the accuracy of negative beliefs. Most fascinating was Sigrid the Outcast, a woman whose own mental health struggles had led to her exile from mainstream Viking society, but who became one of the most effective healers for other outcasts and marginalized individuals. Sigrid had been declared God-touched in her youth after experiencing what we would recognize as a psychotic episode involving auditory hallucinations and elaborate delusions about being chosen for a divine mission. When her prophetic abilities failed to manifest and her condition became inconvenient for her family, she was quietly encouraged to relocate to the edges of civilized society. Rather than disappearing into obscurity, Sigrid created an informal network of support for other individuals whose mental health problems had made them social outcasts. She established what was essentially a commune for Vikings who didn't fit into traditional social categories: the permanently mentally ill, individuals with developmental disabilities, people whose conditions made them unsuitable for normal family life, and various social misfits who had been rejected by their original communities. Sigrid's community operated on principles that were centuries ahead of their time. They practiced what we would recognize as peer support, where individuals with similar conditions helped each other develop coping strategies and maintain social connections. They created alternative economic systems that allowed people with various disabilities to contribute according to their abilities rather than competing in traditional Viking social and economic structures. Most remarkably, they developed forms of collective decision-making that accommodated different cognitive styles and communication abilities, ensuring that even severely mentally ill individuals had voices in community decisions. These weren't isolated incidents. The lives and work of Viking mental health specialists were intricately connected through networks of professional relationships, personal connections and practical necessity that created a surprisingly sophisticated informal healthcare system throughout Scandinavia. Astrid the herb wife and Bjorn the mind mender, for example, developed a collaborative relationship that anticipated modern integrated approaches to mental health treatment by several centuries. They recognized that many mental health problems required both pharmaceutical and psychological intervention, and they worked together to provide comprehensive treatment for patients whose conditions were too complex for either herbal medicine or cognitive therapy alone. Their collaboration began when they were both consulted about a young warrior whose battle trauma had resulted in both severe anxiety symptoms and persistent negative thinking patterns. Astrid's herbal treatments helped manage the physical symptoms, the insomnia, panic attacks, and hypervigilance that were making it impossible for the warrior to function in daily life. But the herbs couldn't address the underlying thought patterns that were maintaining his psychological distress, the persistent beliefs that he was cursed, that he was responsible for his comrades' deaths, and that he would never be safe again. Bjorn's cognitive approaches helped the warrior develop more balanced perspectives on his traumatic experiences and learn strategies for managing intrusive thoughts and memories. But his psychological techniques weren't sufficient for managing the intense physical symptoms that would trigger during stress responses, creating a cycle where anxiety symptoms would undermine his ability to use cognitive coping strategies effectively. Working together, they developed integrated treatment protocols that combined Astrid's pharmaceutical knowledge with Bjorn's psychological techniques. They discovered that certain herbal preparations could enhance the effectiveness of cognitive therapy by reducing anxiety enough to allow patients to engage with therapeutic techniques, while cognitive strategies could reduce the doses of herbal medications needed to manage symptoms, minimizing side effects and dependency issues. This collaboration model spread throughout their region as other healers observed the superior results achieved through integrated approaches. Within a generation, it became common practice for Viking communities to have teams of specialists working together rather than individual healers working in isolation, creating early examples of interdisciplinary mental health treatment. The connections extended beyond professional collaboration to personal relationships that shaped how mental health treatment evolved in Viking society. Sigrid the outcast, despite her marginalized social status, maintained relationships with mainstream healers who would consult with her about difficult cases and refer patients whose conditions couldn't be managed within traditional family and community structures. These referral networks created pathways for individuals whose mental health problems were too severe or disruptive for standard Viking social accommodations. Rather than simply abandoning these patients, communities developed systems for connecting them with alternative forms of care and support. This represented a significant evolution in Viking approaches to mental health, moving from a purely family-based model to recognition that some conditions required specialized intervention and alternative social arrangements. The webs of relationships also included political and economic networks that influenced how mental health services were funded and organized. Successful healers like Astrid and Bjorn developed relationships with wealthy families and powerful political figures who would sponsor their work in exchange for priority access to their services. These patronage relationships created stable funding for mental health treatment and research, but also influenced which types of conditions received attention and which populations had access to the best available care. The interconnections revealed how mental health treatment was embedded in larger social and economic systems that shaped both opportunities and limitations for healing. Healers had to navigate complex relationships with religious authorities, political leaders, and economic interests while trying to provide effective care for their patients. Their success often depended as much on their political and social skills as on their medical knowledge, creating selection pressures that favored healers who could work effectively within existing power structures while still advocating for their patients' needs. Most significantly, these networks created systems for sharing knowledge and innovations that accelerated the development of more effective mental health treatments. Successful techniques developed by one healer would spread throughout the network, while failed approaches would be quickly abandoned in favor of more effective alternatives. This informal system of knowledge sharing created a form of collective learning that improved mental health care throughout Viking communities, even in the absence of formal educational institutions or standardized training programs. To understand how these mental health specialists operated, you have to understand the broader cultural context that shaped Viking attitudes toward healing, social deviance, and community responsibility. Daily life in medieval Scandinavia was harsh, unpredictable, and often violent, creating conditions where mental health problems were common, but also where communities couldn't afford to lose potentially productive members to psychological difficulties. Viking beliefs about mental illness were deeply embedded in their understanding of fate, honor, and supernatural intervention. Mental health problems weren't viewed as purely medical issues. They were seen as reflections of an individual's relationship with the gods, their family's honor, and their role in the cosmic struggle between order and chaos that defined Viking cosmology. This meant that treating mental illness involved not just addressing symptoms, but also negotiating complex social and spiritual relationships that affected entire communities. The social structures that governed Viking life created both opportunities and obstacles for mental health treatment. The emphasis on family loyalty and collective responsibility meant that mentally ill individuals often had strong support networks that were willing to invest significant resources in their care. But the same emphasis on family honor could make mental illness a source of shame that families might try to hide or manage privately rather than seeking appropriate help. What was considered normal versus exceptional behavior varied significantly, depending on context, social status, and timing. Warriors were expected to be aggressive and risk-taking, which meant that some behaviors that would be considered pathological in other contexts were viewed as appropriate expressions of martial virtue. Religious practitioners were expected to have unusual experiences and insights, creating space for some types of mental health conditions to be interpreted as spiritual gifts rather than illnesses. The economic realities of Viking life created practical constraints on mental health treatment that influenced which approaches were developed and which individuals received care. Communities operating at subsistence levels couldn't afford to support individuals who couldn't contribute to collective survival, creating pressure to find ways to integrate mentally ill individuals into productive roles or to develop efficient treatments that could quickly restore functionality. The seasonal rhythms of Viking life, long dark winters, followed by intense periods of agricultural and military activity, created patterns of mental health challenges that required adaptive responses. Seasonal depression was endemic in northern Scandinavia, but communities developed cultural practices and social institutions that helped people cope with extended periods of darkness and social isolation. Gender roles created different pathways for expressing and treating mental health problems, with some conditions being more acceptable for men versus women, and different types of treatment being available depending on gender. Women had more opportunities to be recognized as having spiritual gifts, while men were more likely to have their symptoms interpreted in terms of battle trauma or warrior culture. Perhaps most ironic was how Viking societies simultaneously developed some of the most progressive mental health treatment approaches of their era, while maintaining social systems that actively created many of the mental health problems they were trying to treat. They recognized the importance of social support, individualized treatment, and community integration for mentally ill individuals, while operating warrior cultures that deliberately traumatized young men through violence and social isolation. The same communities that created sophisticated treatment protocols for battle trauma would send their sons into combat situations designed to produce exactly the psychological injuries they had learned to heal. They understood that mental health problems were often treatable conditions that deserved compassionate intervention, while simultaneously viewing violence and emotional suppression as essential elements of masculine identity. Viking healers developed remarkable insights into the psychological effects of social isolation, family dysfunction, and community rejection, while operating within social systems that routinely used exile, shunning, and social exclusion as punishment and social control mechanisms. They recognized that mental health required stable relationships and community belonging, while maintaining honor-based social codes that could destroy individual and family reputations over minor disputes. The contradiction extended to their understanding of individual agency and responsibility. Vikings developed sophisticated concepts of mental illness that recognized some conditions as beyond individual control, requiring community support and specialized treatment. But they also maintained legal and social systems that held individuals strictly accountable for their actions, regardless of mental state, creating impossible situations for people whose conditions affected their behavior. Perhaps most fascinating was how the same society that could provide remarkably progressive treatment for some mental health conditions could be utterly indifferent to others that didn't fit their cultural categories or serve their practical needs. They had advanced understanding of trauma treatment and anxiety management, but showed little interest in or sympathy for conditions that didn't have obvious connections to warfare, religious experience, or social utility. These contradictions weren't simply historical curiosities, they reflected fundamental tensions between individual needs and community survival, between compassionate care and practical necessity that continue to influence how societies approach mental health treatment today. The Vikings just happened to work out these tensions in a cultural context that involved more axes and fewer insurance companies than we're used to dealing with. Everything changed when Christianity began its inexorable march through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, bringing with it an entirely different understanding of mental illness that was about as compatible with Viking approaches as oil is with water, which is to say, they could coexist in the same container, but the results were messy, unpredictable, and occasionally explosive. The Christian framework for understanding mental illness was fundamentally different from the Viking system in ways that created profound conflicts over diagnosis, treatment, and social response. Where Vikings saw a spectrum of conditions ranging from divine gifts to supernatural curses, Christians operated with a much more binary system. Mental illness was either demonic possession requiring exorcism, or it was divine punishment for sin requiring repentance and spiritual purification. The nuanced Viking understanding of different types of mental conditions, each with its own causes and treatments, was replaced by a simplified system that offered fewer diagnostic categories but claimed universal applicability. This wasn't simply a matter of replacing one set of superstitions with another. The practical implications for mentally ill individuals were enormous. Viking treatments had emphasized community integration, social support, and finding productive roles for people whose minds worked differently. Christian approaches emphasize spiritual warfare, individual responsibility for sin, and the need to purify or isolate individuals whose conditions were seen as spiritually dangerous. The background to this change was the broader political and cultural transformation of Scandinavia as local rulers converted to Christianity for political and economic reasons, bringing their communities along with them, whether those communities were ready for theological revolution or not. Kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway weren't just changing their personal religious beliefs, they were implementing new legal systems, social structures, and cultural institutions that reflected Christian rather than pagan approaches to everything from marriage to mental health. Why this moment was different from earlier cultural changes was the systematic nature of Christian conversion. Previous religious and cultural shifts in Viking society had generally involved adding new beliefs and practices to existing systems rather than replacing them entirely. But Christianity demanded exclusive allegiance and actively worked to eliminate competing belief systems, creating a cultural transformation that was more radical and disruptive than anything Scandinavia had experienced before. The key factors that led to this transformation included political pressure from Christian neighbors who offered economic and military advantages to converted rulers, the appeal of Christian institutional structures that offered more centralized control over diverse populations, and the practical advantages of joining the broader European cultural and economic system that was increasingly dominated by Christian kingdoms. But perhaps most importantly, the Christian system offered answers to questions about suffering and meaning that Viking culture had struggled to address satisfactorily. The problem of why good people experienced mental illness, why some treatments worked while others failed, and what communities owed to individuals whose conditions made them burdens rather than assets were questions that Viking theology had never resolved completely. Christianity offered a different framework for understanding these issues, even if that framework wasn't necessarily more accurate or helpful in practical terms. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual, often violent process that played out differently in different communities and created generations of conflict over how mental illness should be understood and treated. The change unfolded through a series of confrontations between Christian missionaries and traditional healers, political struggles over legal and social authority, and practical conflicts over how to care for mentally ill community members. Resistance to change came from multiple sources and took various forms, from passive non-compliance to active rebellion. Traditional healers like Astrid the Herb Wife found themselves marginalized as Christian authorities declared their practices to be witchcraft or demonic collaboration. The Völvers and Seder practitioners who had served as mental health specialists were particularly targeted, since their claims of supernatural communication were seen as direct challenges to Christian monopoly over spiritual authority. Many families resisted the new approaches because they had seen traditional treatments work for their mentally ill relatives and were reluctant to abandon methods that had proven effective. They continued to use herbal remedies and traditional therapeutic techniques while publicly conforming to Christian requirements, creating parallel systems of mental health care that operated alongside official Christian institutions. The champions of change included not only Christian missionaries and converted rulers, but also some individuals who had been marginalized by traditional Viking society and saw Christianity as offering better opportunities for social integration and support. Some mentally ill individuals found that Christian frameworks for understanding their conditions were more hopeful or meaningful than traditional explanations, particularly if their conditions hadn't responded well to pagan treatments. Christian institutions offered different types of support structures that were attractive to some families dealing with mental illness. Monasteries and convents provided options for long-term care that didn't exist in traditional Viking society, while Christian emphasis on charity and care for the suffering created new social expectations about community responsibility for mentally ill individuals. The specific steps of transformation varied by region and community, but generally followed predictable patterns. First came the conversion of political leaders and the establishment of Christian legal authority over pagan practices. Traditional healers were forbidden from practicing their crafts. Supernatural explanations for mental illness were declared heretical, and new institutions were established to provide Christian alternatives to traditional mental health care. The second stage involved the active suppression of traditional practices, combined with efforts to demonstrate the superiority of Christian approaches. Public exorcisms were performed on individuals whose conditions were attributed to demonic possession. Christian healing miracles were promoted and publicized, and traditional healers who continued practicing were prosecuted as witches or heretics. The third stage was the most crucial and often the most violent. The period when communities had to decide between old and new approaches when dealing with actual mental health crises. When traditional treatments were forbidden but Christian alternatives proved ineffective, families faced impossible choices about how to care for their mentally ill relatives. Obstacles encountered during this transformation were substantial and, sometimes, insurmountable. Many Christian missionaries had little practical knowledge about mental health treatment and were unprepared to replace the sophisticated systems they were dismantling. The emphasis on spiritual causes for mental illness meant that Christian treatments often failed to address the practical needs of mentally ill individuals and their families. The language barriers and cultural differences between Christian and Viking approaches to mental health created confusion and misunderstanding that sometimes had tragic consequences. Conditions that Vikings understood as treatable medical problems were reinterpreted as spiritual crises, requiring completely different interventions, leading to inappropriate treatments that could worsen rather than improve patient outcomes. Breakthrough. Moments came when individual Christian practitioners began incorporating elements of traditional Viking treatment approaches into their work, creating hybrid systems that combined Christian theological frameworks with proven therapeutic techniques. Some monasteries developed sophisticated approaches to caring for mentally ill individuals that drew heavily on traditional knowledge about herbal medicine, social support, and community integration. The most successful Christian mental health practitioners were often those who had been trained in traditional methods before converting, allowing them to maintain effective treatment techniques while adapting their explanations to Christian theological requirements. These individuals served as bridges between old and new systems, helping communities navigate the transition without completely abandoning approaches that had proven effective. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces in driving these changes was complex and often contradictory. While political and religious leaders initiated the transformation, its success or failure in specific communities often depended on the decisions and actions of individual healers, patients, and families who had to navigate the practical challenges of caring for mentally ill individuals during a period of cultural upheaval in the years and decades that followed the initial Christian transformation of Scandinavian mental health practices. Something fascinating and completely unexpected happened. Instead of the complete replacement of pagan approaches with Christian alternatives, communities began developing hybrid systems that combined elements of both traditions in ways that neither Vikings nor Christians had originally intended. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of fusion cuisine, except instead of combining different food traditions, they were mixing theological frameworks with practical psychology, and the results were both more sophisticated and more bizarre than either parent system. The new challenges that emerged weren't just about reconciling competing belief systems, they were about managing the practical realities of caring for mentally ill individuals in communities that had lost much of their traditional healing knowledge but hadn't yet developed effective Christian alternatives. Communities found themselves dealing with mentally ill individuals using approaches that satisfied Christian theological requirements, but often failed to address the actual symptoms that patients and families were struggling with on a daily basis. The evolution of the situation was driven by pragmatic necessity rather than theological consistency. When Christian exorcism failed to help a depressed farmer who couldn't work his fields, and when prayer proved ineffective for managing a warrior's PTSD symptoms, communities had to choose between maintaining theological purity and actually helping their suffering members. Unsurprisingly, most communities chose practical effectiveness over doctrinal consistency, leading to the development of treatment approaches that combined Christian explanations with whatever traditional techniques actually worked. Second generation. Effects included the emergence of a new class of healers who had been trained in both traditional and Christian approaches, creating practitioners who could navigate between competing systems depending on what worked best for specific patients and situations. These hybrid healers became skilled at describing traditional treatments in Christian terminology, allowing them to use effective pagan techniques while maintaining their standing within Christian communities. The most significant development was the gradual recognition that mental illness might have multiple causes requiring different types of intervention. While official Christian doctrine maintained that all mental health problems were spiritual in origin, practical experience forced communities to acknowledge that some conditions responded better to herbal medicine, others to social support, and still others to what we might recognize as early forms of psychological therapy. This led to the development of integrated treatment approaches that were more sophisticated than either the original Viking or Christian systems had been individually. Communities learned to use Christian institutions and resources to support treatment approaches that drew heavily on traditional knowledge, creating systems that were both theologically acceptable and practically effective. The geographic variation in how these hybrid systems developed was enormous, reflecting differences in local traditions, the thoroughness of Christian conversion, and the pragmatic challenges faced by different communities. Some regions maintained strong underground networks of traditional healers who continued practicing in secret, while others developed openly syncretic approaches that combined Christian and pagan elements without trying to hide the mixture. The most important new figures in this evolving landscape were the monk healers, a remarkable group of individuals who had received formal Christian religious training but had also apprenticed with traditional Viking healers before or after their conversion. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, as Christian institutions offered few opportunities for women to serve as official healers, became the crucial bridge between old and new approaches to mental health treatment. Brother Erik of Odense was probably the most famous of these monk healers, and his career illustrates both the opportunities and contradictions inherent in trying to practice integrated mental health care within Christian institutional frameworks. Erik had been trained as a traditional herbwife's apprentice before converting to Christianity and entering monastic life, giving him practical knowledge about medicinal plants and psychological techniques that most Christian healers lacked. Erik's approach was to maintain traditional treatment methods while developing elaborate theological explanations for why these techniques were actually expressions of Christian healing rather than pagan magic. He described herbal medicine as using God's natural gifts for healing, reframed therapeutic conversations as spiritual counseling, and explained the social support networks that were crucial for mental health recovery as Christian fellowship in action. What made Erik particularly effective was his ability to work within Christian institutional structures while maintaining the flexibility and experimentation that had characterized the best traditional healing practices. He kept detailed records of his treatments and their outcomes, developed new combinations of traditional techniques based on Christian theological principles, and trained other monk healers in approaches that combine practical effectiveness with theological acceptability. Erik's innovations included the development of what he called scriptural therapy, where patients would read and discuss biblical passages that related to their mental health struggles, combining the psychological benefits of talk therapy with religious instruction. He created healing communities within monastic settings that provided long-term support for individuals whose mental health conditions required ongoing care, anticipating modern approaches to community mental health by several centuries. Another crucial group of new players were the traveling healers, individuals who moved between communities providing specialized mental health services that local practitioners couldn't offer. These healers often had eclectic training that combined elements from multiple traditions, making them valuable resources for communities dealing with unusual or particularly challenging cases. The most famous traveling healer was probably Ragnhild, the road walker, a woman who had managed to maintain her practice as a mental health specialist by claiming that her healing abilities were gifts from the Virgin Mary rather than traditional pagan gods. Ragnhild's approach was to travel between communities, spending several weeks or months in each location treating mentally ill individuals while training local practitioners in her methods. Ragnhild's techniques were remarkably advanced for their time. She had developed what might have been medieval Europe's first systematic approach to family therapy, recognizing that mental health problems often reflected dysfunctional family dynamics that needed to be addressed for treatment to be successful. She worked with entire families to identify communication patterns, power struggles, and unresolved conflicts that might be contributing to individual mental health problems. Her treatment methods also included early forms of group therapy, where she would bring together individuals with similar conditions to share experiences and coping strategies. These group sessions served multiple functions. They normalized mental health problems by showing patients that others had similar experiences. They provided practical advice from people who had learned to manage similar conditions, and they created social support networks that could continue functioning after Ragnhild moved on to the next community. The political authorities who emerged during this period played crucial roles in shaping how hybrid mental health systems developed. Kings and jarls who were trying to balance Christian conversion with the practical needs of governing diverse populations often found themselves making decisions about mental health policy that had far-reaching consequences for how these systems evolved. But some fundamental problems persisted despite the evolution of more sophisticated hybrid treatment approaches. The most significant continuing challenge was the lack of any systematic method for training mental health practitioners, which meant that the quality and effectiveness of treatment varied enormously depending on the knowledge and skills of individual healers, rather than any standardized approach to mental health care. Communities continued to struggle with the economic costs of supporting mentally ill individuals, particularly during periods of economic hardship when resources were scarce and communities had to make difficult decisions about resource allocation. The Christian emphasis on charity provided some institutional support for mental health care, but these resources were often inadequate and unreliably distributed, leaving families to bear most of the practical and financial burden of caring for mentally ill relatives. New versions of old problems emerged as hybrid systems created their own complications and contradictions. The tension between Christian theological requirements and practical treatment needs meant that healers often had to choose between being honest about their methods and maintaining their standing within Christian communities. This led to situations where effective treatments were disguised or misrepresented in ways that made it difficult to teach them to other practitioners or to improve them through systematic experimentation. The integration of Christian and pagan approaches also created new forms of treatment failures and complications. When traditional herbal remedies were combined with Christian ritualistic practices without adequate understanding of how these different elements interacted, the results could be unpredictable and sometimes harmful. Some patients found themselves caught between competing explanations for their conditions that created additional confusion and distress rather than providing clarity and hope. The legal and social status of mentally ill individuals remained problematic throughout this period. While Christian theology provided some protection for individuals whose conditions were seen as divine afflictions rather than personal failures, the practical implementation of these protections was inconsistent and often inadequate. Families still faced potential social and economic consequences when dealing with mental illness, and individuals with severe conditions continued to risk exile or abandonment when their care became too burdensome for their communities. Cyclical pattern of innovation and regression characterized the development of mental health treatment throughout this period. Communities would develop sophisticated approaches to managing specific types of mental health problems, only to lose this knowledge when key practitioners died or moved away without adequate systems for preserving and transmitting their expertise. This meant that many innovations had to be rediscovered repeatedly, slowing the overall development of more effective treatment approaches. Why certain issues proved intractable reflected fundamental limitations in medieval understanding of mental health and the resources available for addressing psychological problems. The lack of any scientific framework for understanding the causes of mental illness meant that treatment remained largely experimental and symptomatic, rather than addressing underlying pathology. The absence of effective institutional structures for supporting long-term mental health care meant that families continued to bear primary responsibility for managing conditions that often required more resources and expertise than they could provide. The geographic isolation of many Scandinavian communities meant that knowledge about effective treatment spread slowly and incompletely, leaving some areas without access to innovations that had proven successful elsewhere. The political instability that characterized much of the medieval period also disrupted the social and economic systems that were necessary for maintaining sophisticated approaches to mental health care, creating cycles of progress and regression that prevented sustained improvement in treatment outcomes. Perhaps most significantly, the continuing lack of understanding about the relationship between physical and mental health meant that many treatable conditions went unrecognized or were inappropriately treated, while psychological approaches were applied to problems that had primarily physical causes. Compared to earlier Viking approaches, the hybrid Christian-pagan systems that emerged during the later medieval period showed both clear improvements and significant regressions in different aspects of mental health. The institutional stability provided by Christian organizations was clearly superior to the informal networks that had characterized traditional Viking mental health care, creating more reliable support systems and better resource allocation for long-term treatment needs. The documentation and knowledge preservation systems developed by Christian institutions were also substantial improvements over traditional oral transmission of healing knowledge. Monasteries maintained libraries and records that allowed for the systematic accumulation of knowledge about effective treatments, creating opportunities for innovation and improvement that hadn't existed under purely traditional systems. But in terms of flexibility and responsiveness to individual patient needs, the later systems were often inferior to traditional Viking approaches. The requirement to conform to Christian theological frameworks reduced the willingness to experiment with new treatments or to adapt approaches based on practical outcomes rather than doctrinal consistency. What was unique about the Scandinavian hybrid systems was their successful integration of competing belief systems in ways that preserved the most effective elements of both traditions while developing new approaches that were more sophisticated than either parent system. This was relatively unusual in medieval Europe, where Christian conversion typically involved more complete suppression of traditional healing practices. What was universal about these developments was the tendency for practical needs to override theological requirements when communities were faced with actual mental health crises. Across different cultures and time periods, communities consistently choose effective treatments over doctrinally pure alternatives when dealing with suffering. Individuals, regardless of what religious or political authorities might prefer. The lessons that could be learned from Scandinavian mental health evolution included the importance of maintaining flexibility and experimentation in treatment approaches, the value of integrating different types of intervention rather than relying on single approaches, and the necessity of developing institutional support systems that can maintain effective practices over time. The patterns that repeated elsewhere included the tendency for hybrid systems to emerge whenever different cultural traditions came into contact around healthcare issues, the importance of individual practitioners in driving innovation and preserving knowledge, and the recurring tension between institutional authority and practical effectiveness in determining treatment approaches. Perhaps most importantly, the Scandinavian experience demonstrated that successful mental health systems require both institutional stability and practical flexibility, combining reliable support structures with the ability to adapt and innovate, based on actual treatment outcomes rather than theoretical frameworks. The comparison with modern approaches reveals both striking similarities and fundamental differences. Like modern mental health systems, the medieval Scandinavian approaches recognized the importance of social support, individualized treatment, and integrated approaches that address multiple aspects of mental health problems simultaneously. But unlike modern systems, they lacked scientific understanding of the causes of mental illness and had to rely on trial and error experimentation rather than evidence-based practice for developing new treatments. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, signs were pointing to another major transformation in how Scandinavian communities approached mental health, though this time the change was less dramatic and more gradual than the earlier Christian conversion had been. The hybrid systems that had emerged from the combination of Viking and Christian approaches were beginning to evolve into something that was recognizably medieval European rather than distinctively Scandinavian, as increased contact with continental Europe brought new ideas about medicine, theology, and social organization. The warning signs were subtle but consistent across different communities. Traditional Scandinavian terms for mental health conditions were being replaced by Latin terminology imported from continental medical texts. The herb wives and vulvas, who had managed to maintain their practices under Christian disguise, were gradually being replaced by university-trained physicians who had studied classical medical texts but lacked practical knowledge about local healing traditions. What key players could see versus what they missed revealed the limitations of both traditional and Christian frameworks for understanding the broader changes that were transforming medieval European society. The monk healers and traditional practitioners who had become skilled at managing individual cases of mental illness were largely unprepared for the institutional and intellectual changes that would reshape the entire context of medical practice. Some practitioners recognized that the informal, community-based systems that had characterized Scandinavian mental health care were becoming inadequate for the more complex and urbanized societies that were emerging as trade and political centralization increased. The traveling healers and monastery-based specialists who had worked effectively in small, relatively isolated communities found their approaches less suited to larger, more diverse populations with different social structures and economic systems. But many traditional practitioners missed the significance of broader intellectual changes that were occurring throughout medieval Europe. The revival of classical learning, the development of university-based medical education, and the increasing systematization of knowledge about human health were creating new frameworks for understanding mental illness that would gradually replace the hybrid approaches that had developed in Scandinavia. The resistance to inevitable change came primarily from communities and families who had seen traditional approaches work effectively for their specific needs and were reluctant to abandon methods that had proven successful. The practical knowledge that had accumulated over generations of dealing with mental health problems in harsh Scandinavian conditions was valuable and irreplaceable, making people understandably hesitant to embrace new approaches that seemed less suited to local conditions and needs. Economic factors also created resistance to change, as the informal systems that had characterized Scandinavian mental health care were generally less expensive and more accessible than the formal medical institutions that were being imported from continental Europe. Families that had learned to manage mental health problems through community support networks and traditional healing practices faced the prospect of having to pay for professional medical services that might not be more effective than what they had been using. Religious authorities found themselves caught between competing pressures to modernize their approaches in line with broader European Christian practices while maintaining the practical effectiveness that had made their hybrid systems successful. The theological frameworks that had been developed to justify the integration of traditional and Christian healing practices were becoming obsolete as more systematic Christian medical theology was imported from continental universities and monasteries. The transformation of Scandinavian mental health practices didn't end with a dramatic collapse or sudden replacement. Instead, it gradually evolved into something that was recognizably part of broader European medieval medical tradition rather than a distinctively Scandinavian approach. Think of it less like a building being demolished and more like a house being renovated so extensively that you eventually can't recognize the original structure, except that in this case the renovations took place over several generations, and many of the people involved weren't entirely sure what the final result was supposed to look like. The specific events that marked the transition were often mundane and bureaucratic, rather than dramatic. The establishment of formal medical schools in major Scandinavian cities meant that new practitioners were being trained in continental European approaches rather than traditional local methods. The standardization of Christian religious practices meant that the theological frameworks that had supported hybrid healing approaches were being replaced by more orthodox systems that were less tolerant of traditional elements. The final major players in this transition were often individuals who had been trained in both old and new systems and found themselves serving as interpreters and translators between competing approaches. These transitional figures played crucial roles in determining which elements of traditional Scandinavian mental health practice would be preserved and which would be abandoned as communities adapted to new medical and religious frameworks. Brother Magnus of Uppsala represented the best of these transitional practitioners. He had been trained as a monk healer in the hybrid tradition that combined Christian and pagan elements, but had also studied at the University of Paris, where he was exposed to classical medical texts and systematic theological approaches to healing. Magnus spent his career trying to translate the practical knowledge that had accumulated in Scandinavian mental health care into forms that would be acceptable within the more formal and systematic frameworks that were becoming standard throughout medieval Europe. Magnus's approach was to document traditional healing practices in systematic ways that emphasized their compatibility with classical medical theory and Orthodox Christian theology. He wrote detailed treatises that described Scandinavian approaches to treating mental illness in terms that university-trained physicians could understand and accept, essentially creating a bridge between local practical knowledge and broader European intellectual traditions. His most significant contribution was probably his Treatise on the Diseases of the Mind in Northern Climates, which provided systematic descriptions of mental health conditions that were common in Scandinavian populations, along with treatment. Approaches that combined traditional techniques with classical medical theory. This work served as a model for how local healing traditions could be integrated into broader European medical practice without losing their practical effectiveness. The last attempts to preserve traditional approaches came primarily from rural communities that had less contact with urban centers and universities. These communities continued using traditional healing methods long after they had been abandoned in more cosmopolitan areas, creating pockets of traditional practice that preserved knowledge about effective treatments, even as the broader culture moved toward more standardized approaches. Some families and communities made deliberate efforts to maintain traditional healing knowledge by training young people in old methods, while also ensuring they received formal education that would allow them to function in the new medical and religious systems. This created a generation of practitioners who could work effectively in both traditional and modern contexts, though they often had to be careful about when and how they used traditional techniques. The dramatic final moments of the traditional Scandinavian approach were less about sudden endings than about gradual obsolescence. The last vulvas and traditional herb wives found themselves increasingly marginalized as younger people turned to university-trained physicians and formal Christian healing practices. The informal networks that had supported traditional mental health care gradually dissolved as communities became more integrated into broader European social and economic systems. The symbolic endpoints varied by community and region, but generally involved the closing of the last traditional healing centers, the death of the final practitioners who had been trained in purely traditional methods, or the conversion of traditional healing sites into Christian institutions that used completely different approaches to mental health care. Perhaps most poignantly, the end of the traditional era was marked by the loss of the language and concepts that had been used to describe mental health conditions in distinctively Scandinavian terms. When communities stopped talking about God-touched madness or wolf sickness and began using Latin medical terminology instead, they lost not just words but entire ways of understanding and approaching mental health that had developed over centuries of practical experience. The transformation of Scandinavian mental health practices occurred because of a combination of internal pressures and external influences that made the traditional hybrid systems increasingly unsustainable within the broader context of medieval European development. The analysis of what caused this change reveals the complex interaction between intellectual, economic, political, and social factors that shape how societies approach healthcare during periods of rapid cultural transformation. Internal problems within the traditional systems included the lack of systematic methods for preserving and transmitting knowledge about effective treatments. The informal, apprenticeship-based training that had characterized traditional healing meant that valuable knowledge was constantly being lost when practitioners died without adequate successors. This made the traditional systems vulnerable to disruption and unable to compete with more systematic approaches that could maintain and improve knowledge over time. The hybrid Christian pagan systems had also created internal contradictions that became increasingly difficult to manage as both Christian and medical knowledge became more sophisticated and systematic. The theological compromises that had allowed traditional practices to continue under Christian authority became harder to maintain as religious authorities demanded greater consistency between practice and doctrine. External pressures came primarily from the broader intellectual and institutional changes that were transforming medieval European society. The development of universities created new standards for medical knowledge and practice that made informal traditional healing appear primitive and unreliable. The increasing systematization of Christian theology made the theological compromises that had supported hybrid practices seem inconsistent and problematic. Economic factors also played crucial roles in the transformation. The growth of trade and urban centers created demand for more standardized and portable forms of medical knowledge that could be applied in diverse populations and settings. Traditional Scandinavian healing practices were often specifically adapted to local conditions and populations, making them less useful in the more cosmopolitan environments that were becoming increasingly important. The role of individuals versus historical forces in driving these changes was complex and often contradictory. While broader historical trends created pressures for transformation, the specific ways that change occurred were heavily influenced by the decisions and actions of individual practitioners, religious authorities, and political leaders who had to navigate between competing demands and opportunities. What could have been done differently is largely a matter of speculation, but it's possible that more systematic efforts to document and preserve traditional knowledge might have allowed for better integration between old and new approaches. Some communities that made deliberate efforts to maintain traditional practices while adapting to new requirements were more successful at preserving effective elements of their healing traditions. The question of inevitability versus contingency is particularly interesting in this context. The broader trends towards systematization, standardization, and integration with continental European practices were probably inevitable, given the political and economic changes that were transforming medieval Scandinavian society. But the specific ways that traditional knowledge was lost or preserved were often matters of chance and individual choice rather than historical necessity. The intellectual changes that undermined traditional approaches were part of broader European developments that individual Scandinavian communities couldn't control or resist effectively. The revival of classical learning, the development of systematic theology, and the growth of university-based medical education created new standards for knowledge and practice that made traditional approaches seem outdated and unreliable. But the practical knowledge that had accumulated through centuries of dealing with mental health problems in Scandinavian conditions was genuinely valuable and could have been better preserved and integrated into new systems if there had been more systematic efforts to document and translate traditional practices into forms that would be acceptable. Within new intellectual frameworks, the immediate aftermath of the transformation was characterized by a period of confusion and inconsistency as communities struggled to replace traditional mental health systems with new approaches that were often less well adapted to local conditions and needs. The transition period created gaps in mental health care that left many individuals and families without access to effective treatment for conditions that had previously been manageable through traditional methods. Who stepped into the vacuum, left by the decline of traditional healing, were primarily university-trained physicians and formal Christian institutions. But these new providers often lacked the practical knowledge and community connections that had made traditional healers effective. The result was a period where mental health care became more systematic and theoretically sophisticated, but often less practically effective than what had been available under the hybrid systems. The short-term consequences included increased costs for mental health care as informal community-based systems were replaced by formal medical and religious institutions that required payment for services that had previously been provided through social networks and traditional obligation systems. This made mental health care less accessible for many individuals and families, particularly those with limited economic resources. Contemporary reactions to the transformation were mixed and often reflected different priorities and perspectives. Within Scandinavian communities, urban populations and political elites generally welcomed the modernization of medical and religious practices, viewing the adoption of continental European approaches as signs of sophistication and progress. But rural communities and traditional families often experienced the changes as losses of valuable knowledge and effective practices that had served their needs well. The attempts at revival or continuation took various forms, from underground preservation of traditional practices to efforts to integrate traditional knowledge into new institutional frameworks. Some monasteries and medical schools made deliberate efforts to preserve and study traditional healing methods, recognizing their practical value even when their theoretical frameworks were no longer acceptable. The most successful preservation efforts occurred in communities that found ways to maintain traditional practices while adapting their explanations and institutional structures to new requirements. These communities created hybrid approaches that combined the best elements of traditional and modern systems, though they often had to be careful about how they described and justified their practices to outside authorities. Perhaps most significantly, the immediate legacy included the loss of language and concepts for describing mental health conditions in ways that had been specifically adapted to Scandinavian cultural and environmental conditions. This linguistic transformation represented a fundamental change in how communities understood and approached mental health, moving from locally adapted frameworks to more universal but less culturally specific approaches. The preservation of some traditional knowledge occurred through informal networks of families and communities that continued using traditional treatments while adopting new explanations for why these treatments work. This created a form of cultural preservation that maintained practical effectiveness while adapting to new intellectual and institutional requirements, though much valuable knowledge was still lost during the transition period. The legacy of Viking Approaches to mental illness shaped later developments in Scandinavian and broader European culture in ways that are still visible today, though often in forms so transformed that their origins are barely recognizable. The fundamental insight that mental health problems exist on a spectrum and require individualized, community-supported treatment approaches became embedded in Scandinavian cultural values that continue to influence how these societies approach social welfare and healthcare policy. The specific influences of Viking mental health practices can be traced through the development of Scandinavian legal systems that recognized mental state as a factor in determining criminal responsibility, anticipating modern approaches to forensic psychology by several centuries. The Viking understanding that some individuals might not be fully responsible for their actions due to mental conditions influenced the development of legal concepts that balanced individual accountability with recognition of diminished capacity. How later generations viewed Viking mental health approaches was heavily influenced by the romanticization of Viking culture that occurred during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The dramatic stories of berserkers and vulvas were often interpreted as evidence of primitive superstition rather than sophisticated approaches to managing complex psychological conditions. This misunderstanding led to the dismissal of valuable insights about community-based mental health care that might have informed the development of more effective modern approaches. The myths versus realities that developed around Viking mental health practices created persistent misconceptions that continue to influence popular understanding today. The stereotype of Vikings as violent, emotionally primitive people who either ignored mental illness or responded to it with brutality completely misrepresents the sophisticated and often compassionate approaches that actually characterized their mental health systems. In reality, Viking communities developed some of the most advanced approaches to mental health treatment available in medieval Europe, recognizing the importance of social support, individualized treatment, and community integration centuries before these concepts became central to modern psychiatric practice. Their understanding that mental health problems could be managed rather than simply endured, and that communities had responsibilities to support mentally ill individuals, represented significant advances in human approaches to psychological suffering. Why Viking mental health approaches remained important in some contexts while being forgotten in others reflects the complex ways that cultural knowledge is preserved and transmitted across generations. The practical elements of Viking mental health care, the emphasis on social support, the recognition of individual differences, and the understanding that effective treatment requires community involvement, were often preserved in Scandinavian cultural values and social institutions, even when their original theoretical frameworks were abandoned. The institutional frameworks that emerged from Viking mental health practices influenced the development of Scandinavian approaches to social welfare that continue to distinguish these societies from other European cultures. The understanding that communities have collective responsibility for supporting vulnerable members and that individual well-being is connected to social health. Looking back across our journey through Viking approaches to mental illness, we've seen a fascinating evolution from sophisticated diagnostic systems that recognize the complexity of human psychology to treatment approaches that combined practical wisdom with supernatural explanation, all occurring within communities that faced the fundamental challenge that continues to confront every society: how to care for individuals whose minds work differently while maintaining social stability and resource sustainability. The key patterns that emerged throughout this story include the recurring tension between individual needs and community resources, the ongoing struggle to balance compassion with practical necessity, and the persistent human tendency to develop creative explanations for psychological phenomena that help communities make sense of experiences that challenge their understanding of normal human behavior. These patterns appeared consistently across different time periods and social contexts, suggesting that they reflect fundamental aspects of how human societies approach mental health, rather than just historical curiosities. The most surprising discoveries in our exploration were probably the sophistication of Viking diagnostic categories and treatment approaches, which anticipated many modern insights about mental health by several centuries, and the extent to which practical effectiveness often trumped theoretical consistency in determining which treatments were actually used. The Viking willingness to adapt their approaches based on what worked, rather than what their belief systems suggested should work, demonstrated a pragmatic flexibility that modern mental health systems might benefit from emulating. The most important takeaways from this journey include the recognition that effective mental health care has always required both individual treatment and community support, that societies can develop compassionate approaches to mental illness even under harsh conditions and with limited resources, and that the loss of traditional knowledge about human psychology represents a genuine tragedy that modern communities should work to avoid repeating. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reveals the complex interaction between cultural beliefs, practical necessity, and human creativity in shaping approaches to mental health. The Viking story demonstrates that societies can develop remarkably sophisticated and effective mental health systems without scientific understanding of brain function or modern medical technology, but also that these systems are vulnerable to disruption during periods of rapid social change. Perhaps most significantly, the Viking experience illustrates that mental health treatment is never just about individual therapy or medical intervention. It's always embedded in broader social, economic, and cultural systems that shape both the causes of mental illness and the resources available for addressing psychological suffering. The Viking recognition that mental health is fundamentally connected to social relationships, community belonging, and meaningful participation in collective life remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. The journey through Viking mental health practices also reveals the persistent human struggle to balance competing values and priorities when dealing with mental illness. The tension between respecting individual autonomy and protecting community safety, between providing comprehensive care and managing limited resources, and between maintaining hope and acknowledging realistic limitations, continues to characterize contemporary mental health policy and practice. Perhaps most revelatory, the Viking approach to mental illness reveals profound insights about human nature that transcend historical periods and cultural differences. The consistent patterns we've observed across different Viking communities and time periods suggest that certain aspects of how humans understand and respond to mental illness reflect fundamental characteristics of our species rather than just cultural variations. What stays constant across cultures and historical periods is the human tendency to seek explanations for mental illness that make sense within existing belief systems, even when those explanations don't necessarily lead to effective treatments. Whether Vikings attributed mental health problems to angry gods or modern societies blamed chemical imbalances, the underlying impulse to find explanatory frameworks that reduce uncertainty and provide direction for intervention remains unchanged. The key human capacity for both remarkable compassion and casual cruelty in dealing with mentally ill individuals also appears to be a universal constant. Viking communities could provide sophisticated patient care for some mentally ill individuals while abandoning others to die in the wilderness, just as modern societies can develop advanced psychiatric treatments while allowing mentally ill individuals to become homeless or incarcerated for lack of adequate community support. What changes across different contexts is primarily the specific explanations and treatments that societies develop, but the underlying challenges remain remarkably consistent. Every human community has had to figure out how to balance individual needs with collective resources, how to manage individuals whose behavior is unpredictable or potentially dangerous, and how to maintain hope and meaning for people experiencing psychological suffering. The capacity for human adaptation and resilience in the face of mental illness also appears to be a universal constant. Viking communities developed creative approaches to integrating mentally ill individuals into productive social roles, just as modern communities continue to find new ways to support people with psychological disabilities. The human ability to find meaning and purpose, despite mental health challenges, remains one of the most inspiring aspects of our species. The universal struggle between acceptance and control in dealing with mental illness reveals fundamental tensions in human nature. People want to help and support mentally ill individuals, but they also want to maintain predictability and safety in their communities. These competing impulses create ongoing conflicts that every society must navigate, regardless of their technological capabilities or theoretical understanding. The timeless motivation to reduce suffering while preserving social order continues to drive innovation in mental health treatment, but it also creates persistent ethical dilemmas about involuntary treatment, resource allocation, and the balance between individual rights and community welfare. The Viking experience demonstrates that these dilemmas are not artifacts of modern medical technology or contemporary social complexity. They are fundamental challenges that arise whenever human communities attempt to address mental illness. Perhaps most significantly, the Viking story reveals that human beings have remarkable capacity for developing sophisticated approaches to mental health care based on careful observation and practical experimentation, even without scientific understanding of brain function or modern medical resources. This suggests that contemporary communities have tremendous untapped potential for creating more effective and compassionate mental health systems if they are willing to learn from both historical experience and ongoing practical experimentation. The human tendency to lose valuable knowledge during periods of rapid change also appears to be a universal pattern that reflects the difficulty of preserving practical wisdom across generations and cultural transformations. The Viking experience with the loss of traditional healing knowledge during Christianization offers important lessons about the importance of systematic efforts to document and preserve effective approaches to mental health treatment. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've discovered about Viking approaches to mental illness. In the early 12th century, as the traditional Viking world was giving way to medieval European Christianity, there lived a woman named Thora the Bridgewalker in what is now central Norway. Thora had been born into the last generation to receive training in traditional vulva practices, but she had also been educated by Christian monks who recognized her exceptional abilities as a healer. Thora's nickname came from her unique approach to treating mental illness, which she described as building bridges between the broken parts of people's minds. She had developed techniques that combined traditional Viking understanding of mental health with Christian theological frameworks and classical medical knowledge that she had learned from traveling scholars. Thora represented the best of what was possible when different approaches to mental health were integrated thoughtfully rather than simply replaced. What made Thora's story particularly compelling was her work with a young man named Leif, who had developed what we would recognize as severe bipolar disorder after surviving a shipwreck that killed most of his family. Leif experienced dramatic mood swings that alternated between periods of deep depression, where he couldn't function at all, and manic episodes during which he would make grandiose plans and engage in reckless behavior that endangered himself and others. Under the traditional Viking system, Leif's condition might have been interpreted as God-touched madness that granted him supernatural insights during his manic phases. Under the new Christian system, his symptoms were more likely to be seen as evidence of demonic possession requiring exorcism. But Thora recognized that Leif's condition required a more nuanced approach that addressed both his practical needs and his spiritual distress. Thora's treatment combined traditional herbal remedies that helped stabilize Leif's mood swings with Christian counseling that helped him find meaning in his suffering and practical training that taught him to recognize the early signs of his episodes and develop coping strategies. She worked with Leif's family and community to create support systems that could provide assistance during his depressive periods and gentle restraint during his manic episodes. Most importantly, Thora helped Leif find a productive role within his community that utilized his creative abilities and intellectual gifts while accommodating his mental health limitations. During his stable periods, Leif became a skilled craftsman and storyteller whose work was valued throughout the region. During his difficult periods, his community provided the support and protection he needed to recover and return to productive activity. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes of our exploration is that it demonstrates the best of what human communities can achieve when they approach mental illness with both practical wisdom and genuine compassion. Thora's approach combined the most effective elements of different treatment traditions, while avoiding the limitations and prejudices that characterized purely traditional or purely modern approaches. What this story reveals about the Viking legacy is that their greatest contribution to understanding mental illness wasn't any specific technique or belief system, but rather their recognition that effective mental health care requires flexibility, creativity, and a willingness to adapt approaches based on what actually helps people, rather than what theoretical frameworks suggest should work. How this connects to everything we've discussed is that it illustrates the ongoing human potential for developing compassionate and effective responses to mental illness when communities are willing to learn from multiple sources of knowledge and prioritize practical effectiveness over ideological consistency. Thora's story reminds us that the essential elements of good mental health care, understanding, acceptance, practical support, and hope remain constant even as the specific methods and explanations change over time. In the end, the Viking approach to mental illness reminds us that human psychology is both universal and culturally specific, requiring treatment approaches that recognize common needs while respecting individual and cultural differences. The Viking understanding that mental health problems exist on a spectrum, that effective treatment requires community involvement, and that mentally ill individuals can make valuable contributions to their communities when provided with appropriate support, represents wisdom that remains relevant for contemporary mental health policy and practice. The connection to modern life is particularly evident in ongoing struggles with mental health stigma, resource allocation, and the integration of mentally ill individuals into productive social roles. The Viking experience demonstrates that these challenges are not new problems created by modern society, but rather persistent aspects of the human condition that every community must address. Their success in developing creative solutions suggests that contemporary communities have significant untapped potential for improving mental health care if they are willing to learn from historical experience and experiment with innovative approaches. What we should remember from the Viking story is that effective mental health care is ultimately about recognizing the full humanity of people whose minds work differently and creating communities that can provide both practical support and meaningful belonging for all their members. The Viking recognition that mental illness doesn't disqualify people from making valuable contributions to their communities offers hope for contemporary efforts to reduce stigma and promote inclusion. How history informs the present is particularly relevant given contemporary challenges with mental health treatment access, effectiveness, and social acceptance. The Viking experience provides evidence that compassionate and effective mental health care is possible even under difficult conditions and with limited resources, suggesting that contemporary barriers to good mental health care are often more about social and political choices than absolute limitations. The final thought-provoking observation from our journey through Viking mental health practices is that human beings have remarkable capacity for both cruelty and compassion in dealing with mental illness, and that the direction societies move depends largely on conscious choices about values and priorities rather than inevitable historical forces. The Viking story demonstrates that societies can choose to develop systems that support and integrate mentally ill individuals, or they can choose approaches that exclude and abandon them. The choice between these alternatives is not determined by technological capabilities, economic resources, or scientific knowledge, but by fundamental decisions about what kind of community people want to create and what obligations they believe they have to support vulnerable members. The Viking experience suggests that the most important factor in developing effective mental health care is the willingness to prioritize human dignity and practical effectiveness over convenience and theoretical consistency. As we reach the end of our exploration through the complex and often surprising world of Viking mental health practices, I hope you've gained not just knowledge about historical curiosities, but insight into the persistent human challenges and opportunities that continue to shape how we approach mental illness today. The gentle conclusion to draw from this journey is that every generation faces the same fundamental choice about how to treat people whose minds work differently from the majority. The Vikings made their choices based on their understanding, resources, and values. We make ours based on ours. I appreciate you taking this journey with me through the fog of history and the complexity of human psychology. The invitation to reflection that I leave you with is simple. What can we learn from the Vikings about creating communities that are both practically effective and genuinely compassionate in their approach to mental health? Sleep well, and remember that the struggle to understand and care for troubled minds is one of the most fundamentally human endeavors we can engage in. The Vikings understood this. Perhaps we can too.